So my name's Samuel Money. I was taking a few notes there, and I am humbled to be here, to be honest, because this is a powerful moment. My background's marketing and branding. This is not a Bronx accent. I'm originally from the UK, but my heritage, thanks for laughing, thank you, right place. My heritage is Ghana, West Africa, but I'm a Brit for want of many reasons, but I still treasure my heritage. So thank you for bringing it up, because I wasn't going to say that until you shared those stories. So my passion is for people, purpose, planet, prosperity, and progress, and CMO marketing stuff. But anyway, it's been a privilege to get to read this book. And before we get into it, we'd just like to say thanks to everyone behind the scenes, taking pictures and audio and everything, catering. It's been a great job. Thanks to Anastasia. And also thanks to Morning Brew for hosting and putting on such a great venue. So thank you for doing that. But enough about me. Let's get into the book. Get into the conversation about the book. So I've been reading this book. I'm a slow reader, and I've taken notes. Look, proof. It's been dog-eared, and there's notes in there, and it's just filled with great stories, great evidence, and evidence-based knowledge that I've kind of felt stuff and thought stuff and believed stuff, but there is now narrative and evidence in this book that you're going to get copies of that is going to change the world. Because that's the thing, when I'm reading this book, it's like, you can't read it and be passive. You got to do stuff. And so I'm excited to welcome Anastasia to have this discussion and conversation. We're going to chat for around 25 minutes. There's a timekeeper somewhere here to keep us on track. And then we're going to allow sort of 10 minutes or so for Q&A. So let's get into it. So easy layup question. Why did you write this book?
What a question. I remember very distinctly my fifth year of PhD studies, and I was sitting at my desk, and I was on a fellowship, as my colleagues from academia know here, which was an academic's dream. And I realized, oh my God, I want to study culture, but I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. I don't want to sit at my desk and think about the past. I want to use the knowledge of the past and the skills that I have to impact culture as it's happening, as I'm living it, as I'm witnessing it. And that was really the start of me looking of where can I apply my skill set and what I was trained to do. And it was COVID, the beginning of COVID, and I was quite randomly invited by a friend of mine from college to participate in a brandathon to encourage mask wearing. And so I joined that brandathon as a strategist without knowing what that means. And in that moment realized, oh, my training, my skill set is actually quite useful for what we're trying to do here. And so the book came from me discovering cultural strategy, discussing topics with people that were specifically apparent and relevant after 2020, and realizing I think this industry could use some of the knowledge and insight that comes from academia, because some of the answers were apparent to me, and I wanted to package those insights in a way that would be accessible to people outside of academia. And so Cultural Intelligence for Marketers was born.
Yeah, and so, I'm listening to you, and maybe this is a bit of a moot question. It's why you wrote the book, if it's a manifestation of your skills and but why is culture the first book you've crafted?
Well, I'm a marketer now, and so I suppose what is more relevant to the world of brand building, brand management, and particularly inclusive brand world building than culture. As marketers, we are constantly tasked with the question of how to make brand relevant, how to transcend advertising, how to influence culture in ways that are, well, in my view, both beneficial for the business, but also drive culture forward, and how to be at the forefront. So zooming in on culture and how we understand it felt very imperative. And what I found is that as my very good friend who wrote the foreword to the book, Dr. Marcus Collins, says, when we ask people, how do you define culture, we come up short. It's a word that we use so frequently, so often, especially in our profession.
Right.
But can we really define it? And so it felt very important to define those terms, define those frameworks, the language we use, so that we could be working towards the same things and we could all be on the same page as marketers who want to be more conscious and inclusive in our work.
I'm reflecting on the word culture, and we'll get into defining it in a bit. Is this the camera for the streaming? Hello, people. Thanks for joining us. There's a group of people in the room. I forgot to say hi earlier, but yeah, just stay tuned. This is amazing content happening here. So I remember using the word culture in business in various companies I've worked at, and talking with leadership about wanting a role which drives culture. And for the most part, senior leadership would laugh. And they would find, oh, culture, ha, ha, ha. And so I've read this book and says, eat that, cultural intelligence for marketers. It's a thing, it's the future, it's the present. But can you help us understand what culture is? Can you help define it? Or how would you define culture? I think you talk about it as simply a version of reality that we inhabit, and you also describe it as a software program sort of often running in the background. But can you?
Yeah, back to where I started, right, where I felt we don't have a common language of how to define it. And what I found when I transitioned from academia and was looking for my footing, right, or where I can contribute, was that we defined culture in marketing as groups of people, their traditions. We know the term multicultural marketing, which I know, some people in this audience and myself are not a fan of.
Oh, okay. Yeah, some people over here like
right. And
sighing.
So how do we define culture in a way that actually encapsulates everything that culture is? I think of culture as an ideology. That is how I define it and talk in the book. And that could be a little bit complex to grasp at the beginning. But I think it's very important to think about culture as scripts, norms, rules that we start learning from the very beginning, from the time we were little. We are socialized in a particular order of things. And as Stuart Hall teaches us, the regime of taken for granted, that's what he calls it, right? We internalize culture, we internalize, I like to make that example, why I as a woman wear lipstick and you don't.
Currently.
And if currently. And why if you were to show up in this space, in this space, you would be totally fine. But in the world, that would be a contradiction. That would be a particular tension in this cultural concept. So who taught us that, right? Who taught us that is how things are supposed to be? And that's why I define culture as an ideology, as a script that we are running on, a software that we're running on that defines how I should present myself, who's considered beautiful, who belongs, who doesn't. And it's a kind of unspoken undercurrent of our reality. And that's why I call it a version of reality, because even if you look at the space, we're all seated in rows, we all have our drink in hand, we're up here, some of us are color outside of the lines and don't abide by those scripts, but all of us are implicated, engaged. We are living that version of reality. That's how I understand culture.
Wow. So we're in it together or individually? Are we together or are we doing it individually?
I think both. Well, if we want to go deep into it, why not?
I mean, why not? That's like you're the expert, so
right?
go for it.
We are in a kind of cultural ecosystem, right? We're all trying to make sense. We're trying to make meaning. And then culture is constructed of shared meanings because we're sitting in a group where all of us understand what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to behave, how we're supposed to present, etc. So even as individually, we might be negotiating our identity, our belonging, the communities that we're a part of. The core of culture is anchored in our shared understanding of these scripts, of the messaging, of the rules, the social values, cultural norms, et cetera. And I think in order for culture to function, we must have a shared understanding of those scripts.
We talked a bit about culture, and I'm going to try and find some pages in this, because I want to sort of talk about brands as well as culture, because that's a key part of this work. And I think in my many notes of this book that I've studied diligently beforehand, let's see, because I wanted to sort of just talk about the brand stuff. And in marketing, we often applaud brands that are daring and innovative. We admire. Sorry, these aren't my words. These are your words. I'm reading it as if like I wrote this down. So I'm reading from page 21 of the book. So just before I get accused of plagiarism here. In marketing, we often applaud brands that are daring and innovative. We admire their bold viewpoints and strong stances. But how often do we pause to appreciate that brands are ultimately run by ordinary people? It's these people behind the brands who have accepted the challenge of being bold, courageous, and self-aware in confronting their own biases and mistakes. So as we think about brands and their role in the world and culture, you describe where brands sometimes fall short in here. And I was curious to hear, which brands do you believe actually meet the standard of what brands should live up to? Which brands stand out to you?
I'd love to answer that question, and I want to link back to what I was just talking about, which is the definition of culture, right? Why is it so important for us to understand our own implication in culture as this kind of script of software that's running? And part of that is because as marketers, right, we are putting things in the world. And so if we are to be inclusive, culturally relevant, et cetera, we need to understand the software that we're all operating on. So I just want to make that connection here of why the definition of culture that I shared is actually very relevant to brands. And the question was what brands are doing it right.
So I think you talk about where brands fall short. I could read some pieces, but I'm just curious to know which brands do you actually believe. Let's start with the positive. So which brands are doing a good job, might you say?
Well, I have a few examples, and I want to avoid the Nikes and Patagonias, Ben & Jerry's of the world, which we are all familiar with. I talk in the book, and I feature example of Billy, which, if you're not familiar, is a direct-to-consumer brand that is specializing in shaving products. And they were one of the first brands that put women's body hair on the screen. And so in 2024, it is almost laughable to say that a few years ago we had ads where women were shaved legs. That is a reality that cultural intelligence. That's a reality that we were.
Did we not notice? I mean, were we just like blind to it? It was just
software, Sam. The software.
So we've been brainwashed. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think that's an excellent example, right? We are running on a software culture, and that was the norm, right? That was the norm. And we would be mistaken not to think that there are certain norms right now that we are completely on board with, that in 5 years we'll look back and say, oh, how did that happen? Like, was that was real, And I think we're in that moment right now. I know my friend Lola and I talk a lot about trans inclusivity, right? And inclusivity of people who break the gender binary or live beyond gender binary, right? And so right now we are seeing a very gender normative marketing, and culture, entertainment, media, et cetera. Will that be the case 5 years from now? Hopefully not. And that's why, we are up-leveling our skills as marketers, right, to think about those issues. But back to your question, Billy was one of those brands that interrupted culture, not in this kind of fickle, purpose-driven way of, handing a can of soda to a police officer, but in a way that...
We won't name the brand, but they know who they are. You know who you are if you watch it.
They found a cultural opportunity that was important for their target audience that was not available on the market, right? And so they spoke to women, femmes, non-binary people by putting depictions and representation of these people on the screen, regular bodies, shaving body hair, armpit hair, like it was there, you could see yourself. And it really took off in a way that was really attached to their product, to their category, right? And what happened was that now they're being emulated by everyone who's trying to get on board with body positivity and women's empowerment, et cetera. So I think those are some of the interesting examples. And we can talk more about recent initiative by Hinge, right? A dating app that's actually tapping into the issue of loneliness among Gen Z and taking a more expansive approach to social connection beyond dating by investing in initiatives that close that gap, that bring Gen Z together. Or Lyft, for example, that I just got to New York City a few days ago, and they, in the app I had an option to be matched with women on non-binary drivers when that's available, because it's called Women Plus. It's a new initiative that finally took off now because they understood the reality of their consumers.
Wow, that's powerful. So it's just happening. Now, when you're talking there, and I may have looked distracted, I'm just realizing you talked about shaving, the shaving ads, which had women shaving already shaved legs. But there was this moment in the world when for femcare products stopped using this blue liquid, right? And they started using this something in the color of blood, because that's what actually happens. So we've been living. Sorry.
Not all.
Well, yeah. Well, so that's the point. So when did people realize this blue liquid is not real? Let's show reality of 52% of the population. And it was like, why were we doing it wrong? Why were we doing it that way before? And now it's permissible just to show actual reality of what actually happens.
Well, you would be surprised, Sam. I read recently that most of menstrual products are not actually tested with real human blood and have not. So now we have a new evolution of, I mean, it's real. That's what I read. Right. And, so we have products for people who menstruate that have not even been tested in an appropriate manner. We probably can have a chat about that.
Yeah, we need to have a chat. It's ridiculous.
It's
like, that is just like, sorry. So I'm just like, that's ridiculous. But I'm part of the problem, because I didn't know that till you told me just now. So as a marketer, I call myself a marketing reformer or a reform marketer, because that sounds ridiculous. But the whole category is ridiculous then, because they haven't tested enough women and they're making products. Who does that?
Right. But to your point, when did we realize? I think marketers might have realized this few years ago, but these ideas have existed on the margins, right? They have existed in cultural discourse that historically marketers don't pay attention to. And that's part of what I try to communicate in the book, is that we need to be listening to people who have been historically silenced, overlooked, marginalized, who don't look like us. I recently went to an event for marketers, and it was 99% white people living in New York City, right? These conversations are happening on the margins, and we're not listening to them. Well, hopefully now we are, and there are a lot of new initiatives and a pressure on marketers and brands to be more attentive to experiences that have been historically overlooked and systematically erased from consideration. And so, I credit social movements with creating that pressure, where some of us in this room have been on the margins of those conversations. I remember being in college and being outraged by some of the brands, deodorant, lingerie brands, and adjacent ads that were circulated around. And I think now we're just listening to people who have been talking all along.
Right. Wow, listening and taking action. But as you've written this book, and I'm reading through it, one of the pieces that seems to stand out is, what would you say to marketers who just don't want to be activists, right? I assume that's the majority of them, by the way, because as I'm reading this, you're kind of compelling and empowering to take all this knowledge and do stuff. And so for those watching, or those maybe, I think the folks probably here are probably activists, but those out there, like, I just want to do, manage the P&L and sell stuff.
Good question. I talk about the art of questioning in the book. And part of, if you open it at the beginning, is a whole section on questioning our own assumptions. And what I learned in graduate school is the importance of taking seemingly obvious assumptions, statements, et cetera, and really interrogating them, right? So marketers don't want to be activists. Why? Is it because they're bad people? Is it because marketers just don't care about anyone else in the world? Or is there a software running in the background that has socialized us into thinking that doing business without ethics is the norm, and activism is the realm that pushes ethics to the forefront? So already we are in a binary, right? Are marketers not interested in being activists? And I'm treating activists as a term here in a broad sense of people who want to make a difference, people who want to live in a better world, people who want to enact change. What has compelled marketers to believe that it is acceptable to do business in a way that marginalizes people, in the way that exploits the planet, that sidelines, overlooks people who have historically not had the privilege to be at the center of product design, for instance, or innovation, et cetera? Who taught us that? Ideology, cultural ideology, right? And so I guess what I say to marketers is time to break out of the boxes, time to break out of the binaries that are limiting us, not only in a way that is keeping the status quo, but preventing us from exercising our imagination of what it means to do commerce with concerns for social, political, cultural, and environmental implications. And I don't know, between the option of doing marketing and perpetuating the status quo, or doing something more innovative, disruptive, and ethically aligned and morally responsible, I would choose the latter. And if as a marketer, one might not be compelled to do so, I would argue that with the younger generation and the kind of ethical consideration the younger generation is pushing to the forefront of society, that is a professional responsibility to attend to those conversations, those questions. If one is to survive and thrive as a business, 5, 10, 25 years from now.
Okay. It's about surviving and thriving beyond. I'll just turn to page 64 because you have a general checklist of questions that you can refer to whenever you need to probe an unexamined belief and or train your team in the process of applying critical analysis. You have questions like, how's the meaning of the concept changed over time? What social forces have contributed to the adoption or rejection of this concept? Are there any historical or cultural factors that might be influencing the way this assumption is being made by me or by others? How do institutional structures and policies shape the interpretation of or application of this idea? So there's a bunch of questions in here, and I counted, I think crudely, in this book, at least 130 questions. So I'm reading this thinking, damn, she's like naming all these questions. So what has made you such a darn good questioner? What skills do we need to get good at it? You got 130 in here.
Teachers. I think teachers who encouraged a attitude of questioning, a culture of questioning. And I think that's what oftentimes I find is missing in my current profession, and is this idea of asking questions of ourselves. How has a software shaped our own understanding, our own perceptions, our own realities? There are not enough focus groups that marketers can assemble to always get it right. It has to start within as well, and we have to question our own perception. And I think that was modeled to me by my teachers, who, as I say in the dedication of the book, were tolerant of my ignorance. And I write in acknowledgments about the moment when I saw Alice Walker speak, and she said, Langston Hughes tolerated her ignorance. So I think we have to be tolerant of our own ignorance in order to ask questions and approach this work through a place of humility where I'm asking the same questions myself every day. And so I think it's a matter of acknowledging that none of us have it all figured out. And by asking these questions, we're actually able to arrive at better answers.
So some people may have heard it, to those listening. You weren't listening carefully. Yes, you are ignorant. You need to read this book to get, because people are tolerant. We're all tolerant of your ignorance. So they're just talking to you. That was a joke, by the way. That's a British joke. May have not landed so well over here. So let's, we've got some time. I'm about to ask if anyone has a question, but I see a friendly face at the front with a question. I
will keep it brief because I want to hear everyone else's.
I'm going to repeat it back just so for the folks.
Okay. I'm glad you ended on that last piece, Anastasia. As you know, you and I have talked about this, and we will continue to. But how do we get marketers to understand that this idea of an aversion to purpose is at complete odds with the idea of branding to begin with? Mm-hmm. And the example I'll note to kind of spark your thought is Unilever as a company was created to create a culture of hygiene. Mm-hmm. Like it wasn't about the P&L, it was about people not dying. So what has gotten us so divorced from the idea that social good has always been at the heart of why companies have come to exist? And how do we bring people back to the idea that it's not about a funny Super Bowl ad, it's about actually helping someone?
Yeah, so for those on the call, the question is basically like the separation of purpose with the fundamentals of the business, and Unilever was about hygiene, so what could be more purposeful for that? Why is there this false narrative? Or
I think that part of that has to do with us as a community normalizing certain values. As I said before, we have created the binary that business is at contradiction with ethics, right? Because it has been normalized in our culture to produce profit at the expense of people and the planet. That has just been the software that we're running on. I keep returning to that. And so, I mean, when we make choices to forego purpose, I don't think I even like that term anymore because it's so loaded, but we forego values of inclusivity, of belonging, of representation. I think there's something that we have to take upon ourselves, the responsibility as marketers who are in conversation with each other, who are working with each other, to ask, what are we doing to ensure that those things are normalized, that they are valued, et cetera. And I think there's an interesting tension that I see in the profession of somebody who's an outsider turned insider and coming from the spaces of academia and organizing. And that's, this fear about upsetting other people. And I think, we talk a lot about that in terms of backlash, in terms of response to our conviction and our values. And I think to answer your question, from my seat, is that as a community, we have to normalize new kinds of ideas, and we have to push back against the encroaching of right-wing ideas upon other areas of social life, because I think that's exactly what's happening.
Because when you think about activists, marketers have always been activists. To be. We're just not being active about the things that matter.
Yeah. I think just building on that, that's the irony. If marketing was created demands for things that we didn't know we wanted, you were always influencing people to act. So what is different than to do it in a way that's more purposeful, regenerative, and sustainable, and better for the world? And so I love that build. I think the question is about Gen Z and social purpose. Well, Gen Z's perspective, the social purpose is anti-capitalist. Or did I get that right?
I think that's right. Yes, yeah. Social purpose.
Of the simplified narrative.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Right. Well, interestingly, when I hear that, and I guess I'll try to get to some answer, but when I hear that, I'm actually interested in how, as marketers, we paint Gen Z, because I've lived in various parts of the country where Gen Z does not embrace anti-capitalism, right? And I've lived in North Carolina, I've lived in Deep South, where actually I think as marketers we have a kind of a blanket idea of what Gen Z is, and so I also want to complicate that, as how we see younger generation, and so the tensions that exist. But I also think that's such an interesting point that you make, because every time I post about something that I like that the brand did, whether that's Nike or Hinge or whatever, there's always a response, well, but brands just want to make money, or businesses just are doing it because of profits, et cetera. And I think my answer is just like, I just don't think that's a reality that we can escape. And I had a particular moment of awakening when I was talking to a professor of mine about leaving academia, and I felt very guilty about leaving and going to the world of business. Like I was abandoning some anti-capitalist bubble where I could be politically pure. And my professor, Dr. Anne-Maria Makudu at Duke's Cultural Anthropology department said, "You're working for a corporation. It's called Duke University."
Exactly.
And so, yeah, and so I think this notion of anti-capitalism is very interesting to me, because I identify as an anti-capitalism. I work for a company. I mean, I'm implicated, and so I just started not to believe in these binaries and started to question the idea of purity and whether there is an escape. And so I would like to think that we can operate on two levels of analysis: understanding the system we're implicated in, understanding what role brands, corporations, brand-driven businesses play, and also operate on another level, which is that people drive those brands, and a lot of people that I talk to in the marketing profession want to move away from the kind of capitalist exploitation, let's just say, and actually embrace a more progressive, forward-thinking, anti-capitalist sentiment.
So I think in your energy that you've been portraying and the content of the book, substance of the book, I read a lot of optimism and empowerment in your writing, in your vibes, as the young people say. So what makes you so optimistic?
The people. I think it's, the experience of organizing with people for social change, the experience of seeing how people resist. We talk about kind of the more cynical reading of the corporate structure that we're in, but there's always people who resist. And I have experienced that outside of business, but I also see that in everyday conversations with young marketers who want to do something different. And people who come to me and say, "Can you put a reading list together? What can I learn? What can I do?" I have to remind myself, even as I could probably, do an analysis, class-based analysis, Marxist analysis, what name you, of the role brands play in the corporate machine, et cetera. There are people who are constantly pushing the work further, pushing the work beyond what we have assumed is given. And that is really powerful to me. And I know we're short on time, but I wanted to read something from the book. It's a cycle of victories and defeats that every preceding movement has endured, a challenge that our predecessors inherited from those who had come before them and those who had become before them. As much as we might wish otherwise, this is the reality we confront. Transformation is never an avalanche of overnight changes. It's a painfully slow drip. No tipping points, only tipping scales. This hindsight is our power, though. This isn't a cause for despair, but a call for strategic action. And so I could keep reading, and I go on and on to talk about how we need to understand change as a cycle of struggles. And I believe that we are in that struggle right now, to the point earlier about the ways that DEI is getting squashed in the society more broadly, and the way that's impacting marketing when purpose-driven, and not just purpose-driven, but in general, inclusive work is being left behind. And what I want to say, I don't want to say that's normal in the sense that we should accept it, but I'm saying that's expected. And so the question is, cultural intelligence for marketers, invitation to start where you are, but refuse to stay there. This book may end here, but the transformation it hopes to inspire, that's on all of us to carry on.
Powerful stuff.
Thank you.
Powerful stuff. So those in the room, there's physical copies in the vicinity. For those watching online, go to your usual booksellers. Make sure you go and order your copy now, multiple copies, and gift them to other people. We want this to be a bestseller. Well, it is a bestseller already. It's a bestseller. We want it to be sort of 20 reprints going. Cultural Intelligence for Marketers building an inclusive marketing strategy. Thanks so much for your time in the room. Thanks so much for your time virtually and online. And we missed out a big chunk of stuff. So there's going to be some sort of part deux, ongoing online Q&A, because there's a bunch of stuff, a bunch of conversation that we couldn't share with you today. And we'd love your questions. So whether it's in the room or virtually, send in your questions, because let's continue the conversation and let's continue the movement. So thank you in the room. Hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Let's go mingle, and a round of applause for